But this next story made headlines all across the country, macabre headlines that might have inspired Alfred Hitchcock to new heights. A son who froze his mother after her death, so one day she could return to life. Not his whole mother, just her brain.
An elderly woman whose head was surgically removed by a body freezing firm may have been alive during the operation.
For 6 days, she was denied food and medication. Then her head was removed and stored in liquid nitrogen for freezing.
She was gasping for breath, trying to get breath as much as she could. She was extremely weak.
Gosh, we weren't sure Mrs. Kent was dead when they cut her head off.
We're not stupid. We're not that stupid. I admit we've made some errors in judgment that I wish we hadn't made.
In that bizarre case involving a missing human head taken from the body of a dead woman who had been frozen.
I feel we saved my mother's life, myself and the people in Alcor.
The questions remain. Who has Dora Kent's head, and how did she die?
Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel. How are we all doing? How are we? I fell off a treadmill yesterday, so I'm doing great.
You did this for what? Why not? Why? Why not?
This week's video isn't a movie mystery, but sometimes in life I just want to do whatever I want to do and I don't want to stick to the rules that I set for myself, alright? Today's video I mentioned very briefly in last week's video, which was on the urban legend about Walt Disney being cryogenically frozen, if you want to go and check that one out if you missed it. But yes, today's video is also on cryonics because I'm not going to lie to you, there are so many cryonic scandals. Like, I genuinely think I could make about 5 videos just on cryonic scandals. But I'm not going to do that, and I'm just going to tell you this one because it is truly the most wild, crazy story I think I have ever heard. Like an onion, this story has many layers, and they're all a bit stinky. Let's jump into it. If you didn't see last week's video, I'll just quickly explain a little bit of the history of cryonics and how it works. It will be a little bit more new information, it's not entirely regurgitated from last week, but if you do want to skip ahead, then you can skip to this time. So, as I said last week, the idea of cryonics is essentially this. When a person dies, the cryonicist will freeze their body in liquid nitrogen and put it into a metal cylinder in the hopes that one day in the future, scientists will be able to revive them from their frozen slumber. There is also the hope that in the future, scientists will have discovered the cure to many diseases that we don't currently have the cure for, and they hope that scientists will be able to grow new, better bodies for you with DNA and cloning and stuff. You know, like when a lizard loses its tail, they can grow it back, like that. Though this is what scientists are striving for now, only 60 years ago, the idea of cryonics was just a story, something you would find in science fiction novels. That was until 1964, when Robert Ettinger, a physics professor at Highland Park Community College, published a book called The Prospect of Immortality. The book essentially outlined how Ettinger believed cryonics could work, what the benefits would be, and provided scientific evidence to prove that it may actually be possible to reanimate somebody in the future. If you want to hear more details about the kind of experiments that he had in the book, then I would recommend going and checking out my video from last week. I don't really want to be regurgitating all the same information, so. The Prospect of Immortality was an immediate success. Ettinger became a media sensation, always appearing on radio and television, in newspapers and magazines. The interest in cryonics had suddenly rose tremendously. In June 1964, a man called SAUL Kent heard Ettinger speak on the radio. He was enamoured by the idea of cryonics and immediately went out and bought Ettinger's book. 1 year later, he and some others have founded the Cryonics Society of New York. 3 years after that, they froze their first man, 24-year-old Stephen Mandel. In 1972, a couple called Fred and Linda Chamberlain founded the Alcor Life Extension Foundation in Riverside County, California. SAUL Kent was one of their biggest supporters and raised millions of dollars to build the company. Alcor makes the majority of its money through a membership scheme. Basically, you sign up to become a member and you pay a monthly fee to ensure that when you do pass away, Alcor will be the ones to take control of your body. But despite the success of Robert Ettinger's book, the growth in Alcor's membership was surprisingly slow, and they were losing money for many years. That was until the late 1980s when a certain incident hit the news and people began talking about cryonics all over again. I'll set the scene. It's December 9th, 1987 in Riverside, California. 83-year-old retired dressmaker Dora Kent is on her last legs. She's suffering from pneumonia and also, I think, Alzheimer's. Her son, our good friend Saul Kent, decides that, unlike most children of ailing parents, he's not just going to sit by her bedside and hold her hand while she peacefully passes from this life. No way, Jose. You see, as I mentioned, Saul Kent is the board member of a company called Alcor Life Extension. Extending lives is what they do. Or what they hope to do, but they haven't actually quite figured out yet. Saul decides that he's going to bring his ailing mother into the Alcor facility. What essentially is the plan is that they're going to bring her in and care for her in the facility so that when she does eventually pass away, they can suspend or freeze her as quickly as possible. Their idea is that the quicker you freeze somebody after death, the more likely it is that they'll be able to be reanimated in the future, since their body hasn't had time to go into rigor mortis or start decaying. Do you know what? I sound like I'm being really negative about this, but I do actually think it's a very interesting concept, and everything seems to be going well for Mrs. Dora at this point. Well, not really. She is dying, but compared to how the rest of this story pans out, it is a bit better. Steve Harris, Alcor's resident physician, is on hand when Dora first arrives, checking her condition and putting her on oxygen. Steve Harris then just seems to go on vacation or something because he just disappears from the story at this point, which ends up causing quite the ruckus. By the next day, December 10th, Dora's condition is stable. She is breathing unassisted and is no longer being fed through tubes. Her son, though, seems to be rather less optimistic about this. There's a diary online written by one of Alcor's members, a man called Michael Perry, and he documents exactly what was happening around this time. He wrote that, get this right, on the day of December 10th, he, as in Michael, was talking to Saul, as in Dora's son, and Saul said that Dora's heart has been beating for 84 years now, and it might finally be about to stop.
What the fuck is going on in here on this day?
Who says that about their own mum? Finally! This whole story sounds rather ominous now, doesn't it? Nevertheless, around 10 p.m. that night, Dora Kent is wheeled into the operating room, taken off the oxygen, and her head is shaved. She stopped breathing around 11:30, probably because she's not on oxygen, but Mike Darwin, the president of Alcor at the time, gave her mouth-to-mouth and managed to resuscitate her. As Michael Perry wrote, there was a horrible obstruction in the throat, mucus or something, that produced a rattling sound as the breath was exhaled. But her colour pinked, and at length she started breathing again, shallowly. Though the mission of this whole shenanigan seems to be in aid of giving Dora Kent another chance at life at some point in the distant future, I can't help but think that maybe she would have preferred a more peaceful death, as this whole thing just sounds so stressful for her, especially this part. And if she had Alzheimer's, this must have been doubly stressful. She probably didn't know what was going on. Around 12:25 a.m. on December the 11th, Dora Kent stopped breathing. Her heart rate slowed and then eventually stopped completely. Mike Darwin, who, as I said, was the Alcor president at the time, and Jerry Leaf, who I believe was the head of the suspension team, both checked her heartbeat with a stethoscope and confirmed that it had definitely stopped. The protocol for freezing quickly began. Her chest was cut open and her stilled heart was observed. They began to massage her heart, which I think is to keep the tissues oxygenated, if that's the correct way of phrasing that. Barbiturates were injected into her body to slow brain metabolism. Her circulation was artificially restarted in order to distribute this barbiturate throughout the body. Around 7 a.m, they decapitated her. Her headless body was then wrapped in plastic sheeting and packed in dry ice. I guess the decapitation sounds very extreme, crazy, it's understandable, but it's actually not that uncommon for Alcor and other cryogenic companies to do this. Basically, they offer two different types of suspended animation, so they do full body, which is unsurprisingly more expensive, at around $200,000, or neuro, or head only, which is where they just freeze your head. That's cheaper at only $80,000, and most cryonicists say that this is what they would have for themselves, as there has been scientific evidence to prove that you can freeze a brain and still get brainwaves from it afterwards. But obviously these were on animal brains and not humans. There haven't been any experiments on humans, neuro or full body, to prove that regeneration will work. Also, by the point of reanimation, cryonicists suspect that future scientists will have discovered how to grow new bodies using DNA and cloning, so it's a bit of a waste of money to get your entire body frozen when scientists in the future will just be able to grow you a new and better version of your body anyway. The problem with this tale began to arise 3 days later on December 14th, when Alcor realised they were in a bit of a pickle. There was no physician in attendance when Dora Kent died. Steve Harris, the resident physician as I mentioned, just decided to disappear from the story. Vamoose, go on vacation. Didn't think it was important that he, the resident physician, be there when somebody dies. Actually, sorry, I won't blame Steve. The truth is that nobody from Alcor bothered to contact him. Basically, a resident physician needed to be there to sign the death certificate to confirm from a doctor's point of view that the person was 100% dead. As the physician was not there, the cause of death on the death certificate becomes null and void, and it's then up to the county coroner to perform an autopsy to confirm from a legal point of view the actual cause of death. Here's where the problem lies for Alcor. You can't really allow for a patient to be autopsied, because then there's no way you can reanimate them in the future. But legally, they have to hand over Dora Kent to the county coroner. But perhaps they don't need to give him all of Dora Kent. After all, they don't need the body that badly. On December 16th, the coroner collected Dora Kent's body, but not her head, for autopsy. The coroner, a man called Raymond Carrillo, was reportedly very considerate and understanding towards the Alcor staff. After all, this was only procedure, wasn't it? Considering that they claim they did nothing wrong, it is a little odd that on December 21st, some of the Alcor staff moved Dora Kent's head out of the facility and into a secret, unknown location, kept secret from not only the county coroner and the police, but also some of their own staff. Though they claim they did this just to ensure that the county coroner would not be able to autopsy Dora Kent's head and ruin her chance of ever being reanimated, it does make them look a little bit suspicious. Were they really hiding something? Well, the coroner didn't seem to think so. On December 22nd, Raymond Carrillo listed Dora Kent's cause of death as pneumonia, just like the Alcor staff originally had. The next day, Dora Kent's head was moved back into the facility. The nightmare was all over. Or was it? Unfortunately for Alcor, the story had hit the news, and they weren't exactly treating it with respect. Stories began to circulate, with the speculation becoming wilder and wilder, that the staff had starved Dora for 6 days and then chopped off her head while she was still alive, that Dora had been packed in dry ice while she was still breathing, that this was all some elaborate murder plot by SAUL Kent just to get control of his mother's assets. They weren't exactly painting Alcor, and particularly SAUL Kent, in a good light. Some Alcor members, including the president Mike Darwin, did appear on TV to try and smooth things over, but unfortunately it was already too late. The public had already decided what happened to Dora Kent, and they wanted justice.
The two principal procedural errors that we're responsible for are not having a physician in attendance at the time that Mrs. Kent had her cardiac and respiratory arrest and was legally dead, and bringing her here to the facility despite the fact that her son was present with her almost the entire time that she was here. From the outsider's point of view, that probably looks like a mistake. It was a well-intentioned one. We were trying to provide the best care we could for her, and you know, we didn't think at the time you get caught up in an emergency about what the consequences of that would be.
Good evening to Mike Darwin from the 1980s, and Mike Darwin from the 1980s only. How are you doing today?
My favorite drink. Mayonnaise.
But I will say, Alcor weren't really helping themselves. Their perception of what constitutes as death is so vastly different from the norm that they were coming off a little strangely. You remember that diary that I mentioned earlier, written by Alcor member Michael Perry? On December 25th, he wrote, "We should have frozen Mrs. Kent years ago. Cutting off the head and freezing it solid is a lot less severe penalty than what nature often has in store. Sir, it is Christmas Day. It is the Lord's birthday. Why are you fantasizing about freezing a woman before her time was up?"
She's not a Christian!
In some kind of weird heist, at 2 a.m. under the cover of darkness, Dora Kent's head was once again moved out of the facility and into a secret location. On January 7th, the coroner's crew arrived. The deputy coroner, Rick BOGAN, informed the team that the coroner had found certain metabolites in Dora Kent's body and concluded that Dora Kent must have been alive at the time of her cryonic suspension. A new death certificate had been issued, listing the cause of death as homicide. They were demanding the head of Dora Kent as they wanted to autopsy it. The Alcor team refused to tell them where it was, so they were arrested. A few hours later, they were released without charge. The police weren't giving up that easily, though. About a week later, a SWAT team, along with some UCLA campus police, conducted a search on the Alcor facility. This time, they were claiming that Alcor were harbouring thousands of dollars worth of stolen UCLA medical equipment. In fact, a lot of their equipment did have UCLA ID tags on them. Alcor insisted, however, that they had purchased the equipment fair and square from the university's own excess and surplus property department, and that they had records to prove it. Unfortunately for them, though, the police had also confiscated these records, so they were unable to stop their equipment from being taken away. Side note, I can't believe that a university has such a problem with having too much equipment that they have a whole department dedicated to selling it. Arts universities could never. All in all, the police confiscated 8 computers plus hard drives, backup tapes and printers, about $5,000 worth of the drugs used in the suspension procedure, and Alcor's 2 German shepherds, although for what possible reason, nobody seemed to know. This is another example of where Alcor really shot themselves in the foot. Nothing makes you look more guilty than refusing to cooperate with the police, and there was no way in hell Alcor were going to give up Dora Kent's head for autopsy. The stress of the whole thing became way too much for Alcor president Mike Darwin. Just a few weeks into the debacle, he resigned. It was a huge loss for Alcor, as Mike Darwin was a genius. Alcor then issued a temporary restraining order against the coroner's office in order to protect not only Dora Kent's head, but also the frozen remains of all the other patients at the facility. When the coroner realised he was no longer going to be able to charge Alcor with homicide or with stealing UCLA property, he changed tactics. This time, he was now trying to charge the staff with practicing medicine without a licence, and Steve Harris, their resident physician, of aiding and abetting this practice. Eventually, that tactic too failed, since, like undertakers, Alcor only deal with patients who are already dead. By this point, the public perception had once again done a full 180. Raymond Carrillo had made an absolute fool of himself. He was desperate to charge the Alcor team with a crime, and everybody could see it. His reputation had already begun to falter earlier that year when he had become involved in the death of Liberace, and several more scandals over the coming year absolutely destroyed his reputation. This is where the story gets even crazier. Riverside County in the 1980s was truly wild. So Raymond Carrillo had become well known in February of 1987, a few months before the Dora Kent case, when he became involved in the autopsy of Liberace. Liberace was a pianist, singer and actor, by the way. He died on February 4th, 1987, and the announcement given to the press by his representatives was that he had died of congestive heart failure brought on by subacute encephalopathy or degenerative brain disease. But, yet again, no physician was in attendance when Liberace died, and so Carrillo requested an autopsy. Where on earth are all the physicians in Riverside County? They seem to be suffering from a real shortage of them. Carrillo knew that one of the causes of subacute encephalopathy was AIDS. A couple of days later, he made the public announcement: Liberace had died due to AIDS. I'd like to say this was so unnecessary. What Carrillo has essentially done here is just out this man after his death when he has no say in it. It's incredibly disrespectful and completely unnecessary because all he did was confirm the cause of death that had already been given. In fact, it wasn't even until 2011 when Betty White confirmed in an interview that Liberace was gay and that she had often been used as a beard for him. But either way, Carrillo had no right to do that. If you didn't like Raymond Carrillo before this, you definitely aren't going to like him when I tell you what happened next. On July 17th of 1988, a woman's body was found near Palm Springs in Riverside County. Police believed it was a homicide, and so the body was brought to Carrillo's office for an autopsy. The autopsy was scheduled for 3 days later. 3 days later, though, the body had completely disappeared. It wasn't ghosts or spontaneous reanimation, no. It turns out the body had accidentally been released to a local mortuary who had already cremated it by the time the accident was discovered. The mortuary had been expecting a male body, but didn't bother to open the body bag to confirm the identity of the body before they cremated it. So now the police had an unidentified woman who had probably been murdered with no idea who had done it or how, and no way of finding out. That poor woman, she deserves so much better. You would think, wouldn't you, that a mistake so detrimental as that one would have a fitting punishment. I mean, imagine if she was a member of your family. What would you want to happen? Do you want to know what happened? Are you sure? Well, unsurprisingly, Carrillo blamed the entire thing on the funeral home, saying that they should have checked the body bag, which I suppose is true. And the funeral home blamed the whole thing on the coroner's office. After an investigation, Carrillo blamed his deputy, Dan Cupido, and suspended him for 3 days. 3 days! He got a long weekend off work and then was able to go back in like nothing had happened. It's honestly insanity. There is no punishment there. Nothing. He got a weekend off. And it only gets worse for the Riverside County coroners. In October of 1988, Mark and Gail McClure moved into their new home in Riverside County, California. They had just purchased it from two local deputy coroners, Brad and Dee Dee Birdsall. How many deputy coroners are there in this county? There seems to be a never-ending list, and they're all bloody useless. On moving into their new home, the McClures realised that the Birdsalls still hadn't moved out all of their belongings. They found a note written on a paper towel by the Birdsalls saying, "We still occupy half the garage, the covered patio, part of the brick patio, and still have all of our tools in the shed. Call us if there are any problems." Well, there were problems. You see, this stuff the Birdsalls had left behind wasn't just boxes of old clothes and some tools. It was human body parts. Yeah, bags of organs. The McClures found 25 boxes, bags and buckets filled with plastic bags containing human organs being stored in formaldehyde. Each bag was labelled with a name, date and what was inside of it. They had also left behind a picnic table which they had been performing autopsies on, and hadn't cleaned, by the way. This is a real story. This is a real thing that really happened. Genuinely. Carrillo and his deputy Dan Cupido launched an official inquiry. Dan Cupido was asked a question by a reporter, by the way, and his response is wild. So he said that he didn't know if a residential picnic table was a sanitary enough space for tissue sectioning work, and that if he had known about it, he probably would have objected to it. Probably. Only probably, though. Only probably. What the hell? It turned out that the Birdsalls were working a little side project where they were cutting up tissue samples and organs and stuff to be sent to scientific labs. I can only presume that these came from people who had donated their bodies to science. All in all, I don't think the Birdsalls were charged with anything whatsoever, and the McClures had to clean it all up themselves with no help from the county coroner's office. I told you this was wild! In terms of the Dora Kent story, Alcor ended up suing the county for false arrest and illegal seizure and won both lawsuits, including winning a $90,000 settlement on behalf of the 5 workers who had been wrongfully arrested. The publicity from the Dora Kent debacle also ended up increasing their membership massively, so all in all, they did pretty well for themselves out of it. Though it seems Dora wasn't actually murdered for science, it's still hard to believe that there wasn't something a little shady behind their actions. Thank you very much for watching this week's video. I'm sorry it wasn't movie related, but I found this case while I was researching for last week's case, and I just thought it was so insane I could not stop talking about it, so I knew I had to make a video on it anyway. I hope it made sense because it was really hard to structure. If you did enjoy, then please do drop a like and subscribe if you want to see more like it. If you want to follow me on any of my social medias, they will be linked in the description below, along with all the sources that I used for this video if you fancy some extra reading. Once again, I recommended it last week and I'm going to recommend it again this week. If you are interested in reading more about the history of cryogenics, then I would highly recommend checking out a book called Great Mumbo Chicken and the Transhuman Condition, Science Slightly Over the Edge, written by Ed Regis. It will be linked down below. It's such a good read, and it had all of the stories about the coroners in it, which honestly is the craziest part of this whole video, if I'm honest. If you have any suggestions of any other cases you'd like me to cover, then please do comment them down below. Otherwise, I will see you next week for an actual movie mystery. Bye!